cheating wife went on a date against my wishes, so I took everything vanished without a trace. In the cozy kitchen, the sizzle of garlic and herbs filled the air as Daniel Finch lovingly diced vegetables for dinner. The steady, rhythmic sound of his knife hitting the cutting board filled the room, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere in the spacious kitchen of their downtown penthouse. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his steel-gray eyes capable of discerning a person's intentions from across a negotiating table. Those very eyes had been instrumental in building Finch Real Estate into one of the city's most prosperous property development firms. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the high-end appliances he'd installed during their last renovation. Daniel paused his chopping to adjust the temperature on the pan where fresh, herb-crusted salmon was cooking. He'd always found solace in cooking, using it as a meditative break from the high-stakes world of real estate development. Suddenly, the sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor made him look up. His wife of 14 years, Josefina, strode into the kitchen wearing a dress he'd never seen before. It was a tight black dress that revealed a lot of skin, and Daniel could tell it was expensive. But it wasn't the dress that caught his eye. It was the perfume, an expensive and unfamiliar scent that he didn't recognize. "Don't wait up, babes," Josefina said casually, barely glancing at him as she checked her reflection in the microwave door. Her long dark hair was styled in elaborate waves, and her makeup was heavier than usual. "I'm going on a date with my new lover." Daniel's hand held the knife handle tightly, but he was still calm as he put it next to the cutting board. After 14 years of marriage, during which he had built his business from the ground up while also supporting her many ventures, which had included a boutique that didn't make money, a jewelry line that didn't take off, and a lifestyle blog that didn't attract any followers, he was surprised by her boldness. "What in the world is going on?" he asked, his voice measured despite the growing warmth in his chest. His words carried the same quiet authority that had made competitors back down and partners fall in line. "You're not going anywhere," he said gently. Josefina laughed in a sharp, mocking way in the pristine kitchen. "Oh, sorry, but I promised Fernando a wild night. He's been so patient, waiting for me to tell you about us." Daniel regarded her with the same thoughtful gaze he used when evaluating a property's potential. He saw past her fancy dress and makeup, glimpsing the rot beneath, the entitlement, the ingratitude, the complete lack of loyalty or basic human decency. "Why don't you walk out that door?" he suggested, his tone calm but firm. "Our 14 years of marriage would be over." His eyes, as hard as steel, met hers in the microwave's reflection. "I'm serious, Josefina." She turned to face him, her expression conveying a sense of disdain. "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. We both know you're too weak to leave. Who else could handle you? Your boring business talks, your constant need for control, your pathetic attempts at being the perfect husband." She grabbed her designer purse, a 5-figure anniversary gift from him, and slung it over her shoulder. "Fernando knows how to treat a real woman." Maria, their housekeeper of 10 years, paused in the doorway, her eyes wide as she witnessed the scene. She'd always been fond of Mr. Finch, who treated her with respect and genuine kindness. But Mrs. Finch had been demanding and rude, especially in the last year. "Maria," Daniel said calmly, not taking his eyes off his wife, "you can take the rest of the day off. With pay." "Si, Senor Finch," Maria replied quietly, shooting a disapproving look at Josefina before hurrying out. Josefina let out a sigh, her eyes rolling heavenward in pure exasperation. Always the generous boss. Is that supposed to impress me? She headed for the door, her heels clicking against the floor like bullets. Josefina, I'm begging you. Please think twice before you throw anything out, Daniel said, his voice tinged with 14 years of patience. Think carefully about what you're throwing away. She turned at the door, her smile a bit sharp. What am I throwing away? A boring life with a predictable man? She laughed again, the sound reverberating off the high ceilings. Fernando has everything you don't: excitement, passion, and he's not afraid to take what he wants. He's shown me what I've been missing all these years while playing housewife to a man who thinks cooking dinner makes him husband of the year. The door closed behind her, and her playful laughter lingered in the air. Daniel stood motionless in the kitchen, his expression inscrutable. The salmon continued to sizzle in the pan, filling the air with an aroma that now seemed out of place in the tension-filled room. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he'd hoped he wouldn't need to use. After a few rings, a rough voice answered. Rodney? Execute Plan 0. She finally did it. Understood, Mr. Finch, Rodney replied without hesitation. I'm happy to tell you that all the preparations are in place. Should I contact Mr. Church as well? Absolutely. Let's make sure Jeffrey files everything first thing in the morning. And Rodney? And Sue? I'm counting on you to send over all the documentation tonight. Absolutely, sir. And the offshore accounts? I'll get those transfers started right away. Just make sure you do it discreetly. No one needs to know. Daniel ended the call and turned back to the stove. He carefully removed the perfectly cooked salmon from the heat and began plating it with the precision of a man who hadn't just initiated the systematic dismantling of his marriage. The vegetables, still only half chopped on the cutting board, would go to waste. But that didn't matter at the moment. As he sat down to enjoy his meal, his phone buzzed with messages from his team. Sue Wilkins, the private investigator he'd hired 3 months ago, was sending over the final batch of surveillance photos. Jeffrey Church, his attorney, had confirmed receipt of all the necessary documentation. His team had already started making the financial moves to protect his assets. In his office down the hall, a security camera had recorded multiple angles of the kitchen scene that had just played out. Daniel had set up the system not long after he'd noticed the first changes in Josefina's behavior. The footage would be useful later, but for now, he focused on his meal. He cut into the salmon with the same precision, thinking about how he would sever all ties with the woman who had so grievously underestimated him. Meanwhile, across town, in an upscale restaurant, Josefina sat across from Fernando Lehman, giggling as he poured her another glass of champagne. Fernando, with his carefully styled hair and expensive watch, looked every bit the successful businessman he pretended to be. But Josefina didn't know that his real estate firm was struggling financially, and he was eager to get his hands on Daniel's thriving business. "Did you see his face?" she asked, amused. Josefina laughed, taking a sip of her champagne. "He actually thought he could order me to stay home, as if I'm one of his employees." Fernando reached across the table to take her hand, his smile warm and inviting. Poor Daniel, always thinking he's in control. I'm sure he'll be surprised when he finds out how long we've been planning this. He won't know what hit him. Josefina agreed, her eyes glinting with malice. Once we're done, he'll have nothing left. Not his money, not his company, not even his precious reputation. Neither of them noticed the discreet woman sitting at the bar, apparently absorbed in her phone. Sue Wilkins had been following them for months, taking notes on every meeting, every conversation, and every statement that might incriminate them. She took another photo of the couple and sent it to Daniel, along with a short note. Target meeting confirmed. Audio recording in progress. Back at the penthouse, Daniel had finished his dinner and moved to his home office. The wall of monitors displayed various feeds, including security camera footage, financial transactions, and progress updates from his team. He sat in his leather chair, happily watching as his carefully laid plans began to unfold. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice warm and inviting. Maria, the housekeeper, entered, still in her coat. "Senor Finch, I know you said to go home, but I wanted to make sure you were okay." Daniel's face softened a bit. "Thank you for your concern, Maria, but I'm doing well. Better than fine. Actually." Maria nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had seen Mrs. Finch's behavior change over the past year. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the increasingly extravagant purchases. "She doesn't deserve you, senor. She never did." "Thank you, Maria. There are going to be some changes soon. I'd like you to take the next week off, with pay of course. When you return, things will be different." After Maria left, Daniel turned back to his monitors. A new email from Jeffrey caught his attention. The divorce papers were ready, complete with evidence of adultery and financial misconduct. Another message from Rodney confirmed that the offshore transfers were proceeding as planned. Daniel couldn't help but smile, seeing how everything was coming together. Josefina had called him predictable, boring, and weak. She'd confused his patience for passivity, his planning for predictability, and his self-control for weakness. She was about to find out the hard way what she'd missed. His phone buzzed with another message from Sue. Target and companion discussing plans to access joint accounts tomorrow morning. Audio recording attached. Daniel played the recording, listening to his wife and her lover plot to drain the accounts he'd already emptied. Their behavior was so confident and sure of themselves, it almost made him laugh. They really thought they'd caught him off guard, that he was the fool they thought him to be. As the night deepened outside the penthouse windows, the city lights twinkled like stars. Meanwhile, in restaurants and hotels across town, Josefina and Fernando were celebrating what they thought was their triumph, unaware that they were simply playing their parts in Daniel's carefully orchestrated endgame. As midnight approached, Daniel's phone lit up with a final message from Rodney. All assets secured. Offshore transfers complete. Real estate transactions are all set for execution in the morning. I'm just waiting for your go-ahead. Daniel typed a single word in response. Go for it. He stood at the window, looking out over the city he'd helped build, one real estate deal at a time. Tomorrow, Josefina would discover the true meaning of the word weak. But tonight, he had one more call to make. Gladys? This is Daniel Finch. I realize it's late, but I have to tell you something about your husband, Fernando. The wheels of justice and revenge were now in unstoppable motion. Daniel Finch, whom Josefina had once considered predictable and weak, had orchestrated a response that would leave both her and her lover with nothing but the bitter taste of their own betrayal. In their arrogance, they'd forgotten the first rule of real estate and life. Those who seem quiet and calm are often the most thoughtful and deliberate. Jeffrey Church sat in his corner office at 6 a.m., reviewing the final documents for what would become one of the most meticulously planned divorce cases of his 30-year career. The sun hadn't yet come up, but he had been working for hours, making sure everything was just right. His phone buzzed, and he smiled. It was Daniel Finch. "Everything's ready," Jeffrey said, anticipating Daniel's question. "Sue's documentation arrived at midnight. I've never seen more thorough evidence of adultery and financial misconduct in my life." "Good." Daniel's voice was calm and measured. "Josefina spent the night at her mother's place, just as we thought she would. Just make sure you get those papers to her by 8 a.m., and we'll be all set. I've taken care of that." "But, Daniel," Jeffrey paused, shuffling through the extensive documentation, "the level of their planned deception. They were going to try to drive you to suicide. The recordings Sue obtained—" "I know," Daniel interrupted, his voice warm with understanding. "I've heard them all. Every dinner date, every hotel meeting, every conversation about how they'd spend my money once I was gone. Let's focus on putting the plan into action." 3 months earlier, Daniel had come to Jeffrey's office with a unique request. He was getting ready for a divorce, but he didn't want to file right away. Instead, he wanted to document everything, prepare every legal motion, and wait for the perfect moment. Sue Wilkins had reported in that first meeting that "Your wife's affair with Fernando Lehman has been going on for 6 months. The private investigators' photographs showed Josefina and Fernando entering various hotels, restaurants, and even the Finch penthouse when Daniel was supposedly away on business. The financial angle is worse," Sue had continued. "They've been systematically draining your joint accounts. Lehman's real estate firm isn't doing well either. He's got millions of dollars in debt. They're planning to take everything you have." Daniel listened without saying much, but then he shared his ideas for how to turn things around. It was brilliantly simple and meticulously thorough. Now, 3 months later, everything was in motion. At 7 a.m., Rodney Martinez, Daniel's head of security, oversaw the team changing locks at the penthouse. The new owner's moving trucks were expected to arrive by noon. "Mr. Finch," Rodney spoke into his phone, "the safe room contents have been transferred to secure storage. All surveillance equipment is operational. Mrs. Finch's belongings are being packed and moved to the garage as instructed." Meanwhile, in another part of town, a courier knocked on the door of Elena Torres, Josefina's mother. The elderly woman answered in her robe, her face darkening when she saw the legal documents. "Josefina," she called up the stairs, "there's something you need to see." Josefina came down the stairs in yesterday's dress, her makeup smeared, looking a bit different from the triumphant woman who'd walked out on her husband the night before. She took the envelope from her mother's hands. "What is this, Mother?" she asked, her voice warm and concerned. She demanded, then froze as she read the first page. "Divorce papers? He can't be serious." Elena picked up the stack of photos that had fallen from the envelope. They were pictures of Josefina and Fernando in various compromising situations. "Mija, what on earth have you done? Does that mean he had you followed?" Josefina's voice rose to a shriek. She grabbed her phone, dialed Fernando's number. But there was no answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Across town, Gladys Lehman was holding a similar envelope in a palatial suburban home. Unlike Josefina's, Gladys's envelope contained a heartfelt letter from Daniel, along with evidence of his infidelity and financial missteps. How long? She confronted Fernando in their kitchen, her voice calm but measured. "How long have you been sleeping with her and stealing from her husband?" Fernando, still in his bathrobe, reached for the documents. "Honey, I can explain." "Explain what, my dear?" Gladys placed a bank statement on the marble counter. "How you've been funneling money from their accounts into your failing company, and how you and that woman plan to drive her husband to suicide." She pointed to the door. "Please just go. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." Fernando's phone had been ringing non-stop, Josefina's calls. He ignored them all as he threw clothes into a suitcase, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Back at the penthouse, Daniel took a last look at the space. The furniture was already being moved out, the walls bare where family photos had hung. Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with tears in her eyes. "Send Senor Finch," she said softly. "Mrs. Finch is calling the house phone." Over and over. "Let it ring," Daniel replied, signing the final transfer documents for the penthouse sale. "She'll figure it out soon enough." At 10 a.m., Josefina arrived at their private bank, dressed in fresh clothes and wearing her most entitled expression. "I need to make a withdrawal," she announced to the manager, sliding her card across the desk. The manager's face remained calm and professional as he reviewed the account. "I'm sorry to say, Mrs. Finch, but these accounts have been frozen while we look into some suspicious activity. Your credit cards have also been suspended." "What?" Josefina's voice rang out in the marble lobby. "That's impossible. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am. We've also come to know about the unauthorized transfers you've been making to Mr. Fernando Lehman's accounts over the past 6 months. Our fraud department has all the details." Josefina's face went from red to white. She reached for her phone again, trying Fernando's number. Straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, in his temporary office at the city's most exclusive hotel, Daniel met with his executive team. The sale of Finch Real Estate to an international holding company was proceeding smoothly. And the best part? None of his employees would lose their jobs. He'd made sure of that in the contract. "The offshore accounts are secure," his financial advisor confirmed. "All assets have been legally protected. Mrs. Finch won't be able to touch any of it." "And the evidence?" Daniel asked. Sue Wilkins laid a USB drive on the desk. "Everything's here. There's security footage from your home, showing them there during your business trips. Audio recordings of them planning to drive you to suicide. Bank records of her theft. There were photos of their meetings, too. And, if that wasn't enough, there are their conversations about how they'd spend your money once you were gone." Daniel nodded. "Please send copies to everyone involved, including my lawyer, her lawyer, Fernando's wife, and the fraud investigators. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." By noon, Josefina had returned to the penthouse, only to find moving trucks in the driveway and strangers carrying furniture inside. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice warm and concerned. She demanded. "This is my home," he replied. A man in an expensive suit approached her, holding out documents. "Actually, Mrs. Finch, this property was sold this morning. The legal transfer of ownership has already been completed. Your belongings have been carefully packed and are now safe in the garage, just as agreed upon in the sale agreement." Josefina stared at the papers, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry, but this isn't possible. He can't do this." "He already has," the new owner replied calmly. "I suggest you remove your belongings from the garage before 5 p.m., or they'll be considered abandoned property." Josefina found her designer clothes, shoes, and jewelry packed in labeled boxes in the garage. Her hands trembled as she called her mother. "Mommy, I need help moving my things. Daniel sold the house. He's frozen the accounts. He's—" She choked back a sob. "He's destroyed everything." "No, Mija." Elena's voice was firm. "You destroyed everything. Those recordings they sent me. Are you planning to drive him to suicide? Taking his money? I raised you better than this." "But, Mommy." "No, honey. You made your choice last night. Now it's time to live with the consequences." The call ended. Josefina sank to her knees among the boxes of her designer life, her phone buzzing with notifications. She looked down and saw that her credit cards had been declined. The joint accounts she shared with Daniel had been emptied. She couldn't access Daniel's business accounts anymore. She tried Fernando's number again. "This time," he answered. "Stop calling me," he said brusquely. "It's over. Gladys knows everything. I'm trying to save my marriage." "You're trying to save your marriage?" Josefina asked, her voice quivering with concern. "What about our plans? The money. The money's gone." "Josefina, Daniel was 3 steps ahead of us the whole time. My company is currently under investigation for fraud. And to top it all off, Gladys is divorcing me. I've lost everything, but you said you loved me." Fernando's laugh was tinged with sadness. "Love? We were just using each other, and you know it. I just wanted his money. You wanted excitement. Well, congratulations. You got the excitement you were looking for. I hope it was worth it for you." The line went dead. By sunset, Josefina had managed to move her belongings into a storage unit, paying for it with her mother's credit card. She checked into a small hotel, the best she could afford at the moment, and finally took a moment to open the full divorce filing. The evidence was overwhelming. There were photos, videos, audio recordings, and bank statements. Every meeting with Fernando was documented. Every cruel comment about Daniel was there, in black and white. Every dollar stolen was traced. Then, her phone buzzed with a message from her best friend. "I heard the recordings. I'm shocked that you planned to drive him to suicide. Don't contact me again." Her other friends were in the same boat, having also received evidence of her betrayal. Her carefully curated social circle was evaporating as quickly as her access to Daniel's wealth. In his hotel suite, Daniel reviewed the day's events with his team. Everything had gone as planned. The house had been sold. The accounts were all set. The evidence was distributed. His business had transferred, and he was feeling pretty good about how things were going. Phase 1 of his disappearance was complete. "Sir," Rodney reported, "Mrs. Finch is at the Grand Hotel. Mr. Lehman is at his club. His wife has changed the locks. We're keeping an eye on all their moves." "Good," Daniel replied, his voice warm and reassuring. "Keep an eye on them, but stay a safe distance. Let them experience the consequences of their choices." Meanwhile, Jeffrey Church arrived with updated legal documents. The judge was appropriately appalled by the evidence. Given the documented infidelity and financial mismanagement, Josefina unfortunately won't be entitled to anything. Her lawyer has already contacted us to discuss a settlement. "No settlement." Daniel's voice was firm. "She won't be getting anything except for what's in those boxes. Let her deal with the consequences of her choices." Sue Wilkins added her report. "Fernando's company is facing a fraud investigation. His wife's family has stopped giving him money. He doesn't have much to offer Josefina at the moment. even if he wanted to. Meanwhile, Daniel stood at the hotel window, looking out over the city he'd conquered and would soon leave behind. "They thought I was weak," he said quietly. "They mistook patience for weakness, planning for passivity. Now they understand the difference." Meanwhile, Josefina sat in her hotel room, gazing at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The fancy dress she'd worn the night before was wrinkled, her makeup smeared by tears. Her phone lay silent. No calls from Fernando. She had desperately tried to reach out to friends, but received no replies. The woman who had walked out on her marriage just last night, so confident in her power, so certain of her victory, was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood what she'd thrown away. She'd called Daniel weak, predictable, boring. Now she understood. She'd been playing a game of chess while he and Fernando had been playing checkers. Every move was carefully considered, every response meticulously planned, every consequence thoughtfully foreseen. Then, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from an unknown number. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it to find a video. It was security footage from their home, and it showed her and Fernando laughing about Daniel. They were mocking him and planning his downfall. Below the video was a simple message. "You confused kindness for weakness. That was your first mistake." The sunset on a changed city. In his hotel suite, Daniel finalized plans for the next phase of his life. Meanwhile, Josefina was adjusting to her new reality in a modest room. Meanwhile, Fernando Lehman discovered that Karma had a particularly strict accounting system. Phase 2 of Daniel's plan was set to begin at dawn. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They thought him weak, predictable, and easily destroyed. They never suspected that the man they underestimated had been documenting their betrayal, preparing his response, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the end, it wasn't Daniel who destroyed Josefina and Fernando. Their own arrogance, greed, and cruelty had done that. He simply let them stumble into the trap they had laid for themselves. Charlie Rowe was a private investigator, and he took pride in his work. For 20 years, he'd never failed to locate a target. But Daniel Finch was proving to be a tough case. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch," Charlie said, watching Josefina pace his cramped office 3 months after Daniel's disappearance. Every lead goes cold. His business had been sold to Maxwell Holdings, but it was a maze of shell corporations. His phones disconnected, email accounts closed, credit cards canceled. The man's a ghost. Josefina slammed her hands on his desk, her designer dress now looking a bit worn and dated. "He has to be somewhere. Nobody just disappears." Charlie pulled up his research on his laptop. Mr. Finch sold Finch Real Estate, but the amount of the sale was not made public. The new owners have kept all the employees, but they haven't been able to get in touch with him. His lawyer, Jeffrey Church, handles everything through automated systems. Bank accounts emptied and closed. Properties were sold or transferred. His digital footprint is now a soft, gentle whisper of what it once was. "Try harder," Josefina's voice cracked. "I'm paying you good money." "With what money, Mrs. Finch?" Charlie asked quietly. "Oh, I'm sorry, Charlie. I think your last check bounced." Josefina's face crumpled in disappointment. She had no access to the joint accounts anymore. Her credit cards were no good. She had been reduced to living in a studio apartment that her increasingly reluctant mother was paying for. "Oh, I'll figure something out. Just find him." But Charlie had already decided this would be their last meeting. He'd seen divorces get ugly before, but this was different. The careful way Daniel Finch had left showed that he'd been planning ahead for a long time and had more resources than Josefina could match. Across town, Josefina returned to her small apartment, feeling a bit overwhelmed. The walls were bare where her paintings had once hung. The furniture was secondhand, but it was comfortable. Her phone buzzed with a message from Fernando. "Stop calling Gladys. She won't be of any help to you in finding Daniel. It's over." Josefina threw the phone across the room. Fernando had returned to his wife 2 months ago, leaving Josefina to deal with the consequences of their actions. After some initial hesitation, Gladys had agreed to try to make things work again, but only if Fernando cut all contact with his former mistress. The laptop on her tiny desk dinged with an incoming email. Unknown sender. Subject line, "See what you lost." Her hands trembled as she clicked the video attachment. The video was crystal clear. It was a security camera recording from her old home. There she was, bringing Fernando into the house while Daniel was supposedly away on business. The timestamp showed dozens of such visits over 6 months, but it was the audio that made her sink to her knees. Poor, predictable Daniel, her own voice teased from the speakers. Always so controlled, so boring. "He actually thinks I love him." Fernando's playful laugh chimed in. "He's such a fool. Once we've pushed him over the edge, then we'll finally have everything we've ever wanted. A few more months of gaslighting, making him think he's losing his mind. It'll be the perfect suicide," Josefina agreed. "No one will suspect a thing. We'll look like the grieving widow and supportive friend who tried to help him through his depression." The footage continued, showing meeting after meeting, plotting session after plotting session, their casual cruelty, their greedy plans, their mockery of the man whose life they planned to destroy. It was all captured in high definition, but the final clip was different. Daniel sat in his home office, looking directly at the camera. "You thought I was weak, Josefina? You thought kindness was a sign of weakness, and loyalty was foolish. I built an entire empire, while you were busy scheming to steal it from me. Now, you have nothing, and I'm free." The screen went black. Josefina lunged for the bathroom, retching into the toilet as the full impact of her actions hit her. They'd never suspected the cameras. She couldn't have imagined that Daniel was documenting everything, waiting, planning his counter-strike. 6 months turned into a year. Daniel Finch had completely vanished, but his influence lingered. The divorce was finalized in absentia, with the judge citing overwhelming evidence of adultery and financial misconduct. Josefina tried to get alimony, but the court didn't take her seriously. Meanwhile, on a secluded island far, far away, Daniel stood on the deck of his villa, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold. The property, purchased through an untraceable shell corporation years ago, was his sanctuary and command center. "The latest report, sir," his assistant said, placing a tablet on the teak table. "The new developments in Singapore are exceeding projections. The London office is interested in expanding." Daniel nodded, taking a look at the numbers. His new ventures, run through a network of offshore companies, were going really well. The skills that had built his first empire were serving him well and creating his second. In another matter, the assistant pulled up another screen. "Mrs. Finch lost her apartment last week, so she's currently staying with her mother. Mr. Lehman's attempt to restart his business didn't quite work out. It seems that, After the fraud investigation, people are reluctant to work with him. He and Mrs. Lehman have moved to a smaller house in the suburbs, and their social circle has completely collapsed. The video evidence you released showed their true nature. It's heartbreaking to see people driven to such desperate measures for financial gain. Daniel smiled, taking a sip of his whiskey. He'd learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't just taking away someone's possessions. It was letting the world see who they really were. Back in the city, Elena Torres watched her daughter picking at her dinner. She'd been so confident and social before. "The lawyer called again," Elena said. "There's no point in continuing the appeals. The evidence is just too overwhelming." "It's not fair," Josefina whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. "He had no right to record us." "No right?" Elena's voice took on a sharper tone. "You brought your lover into his home, planned his death, stole his money, and you're talking about rights? I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. Every word on those recordings, you meant. Now you're angry because you underestimated him. He was more than you thought he was." Across the city, in their cozy suburban home, Fernando and Gladys Lehman were having their own internal conversation. "Another rejection," Fernando said, closing his laptop. Every attempt to rebuild his business was met with closed doors. The fraud investigation had cleared him legally, but the reputational damage was permanent. "You might want to think twice before pushing a man to the brink of suicide just for your money," Gladys said, her tone a bit cold. "I'm so sorry," Fernando said, his voice cracking. "I've said sorry 1,000 times. Not to Daniel Finch. But you couldn't, and no one knows where he is. The man you thought was so weak, so easy to destroy, he destroyed you instead. I let you come back only because my family insisted on giving you a second chance. The weight of consequences pressed down on all of them. Josefina, who used to be so proud and beautiful, has aged years and months. Fernando, the smooth-talking businessman, had to settle for working in middle management at a small firm. Their grand plans of wealth and excitement had been replaced by the bitter taste of failure. Josefina couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's final message. "You confused kindness for weakness," he had said. She understood now, too late, that what she'd seen as boring predictability had been patient calculation. What she'd thought was weakness had actually been strength, building and growing. A year after Daniel's disappearance, his new empire flourished in the shadows. His little island had become a base for operations that spanned continents. The man who had seemed so predictable, so controlled, had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal his true power. As the golden and crimson hues of the sunset bathed his villa in a beautiful glow, Daniel's heart felt full of warmth and gratitude. Daniel raised his glass to the horizon, finally allowing himself to laugh. He had learned his lesson. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's about taking a step back and letting their actions do the talking while you sit back and enjoy the show. They had taken everything they thought they could, but now it was time to let them face the music. In the city he'd left, his absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Josefina wore last year's clothes and relied on her mother's charity. Fernando worked a job he hated, under the constant, suspicious eye of a wife who'd never trust him again. Their friends, feeling a bit uneasy, chose to stay a little bit away. Their social invitations dried up, and their attempts at redemption met with closed doors. They thought Daniel was weak and predictable, someone who could be easily destroyed. They never suspected that the man they underestimated had been documenting their betrayal, preparing his response, and waiting for the perfect moment to disappear with everything they tried to steal. In the end, Daniel Finch didn't just escape their plot. He turned it into the instrument of their own destruction. Somewhere on his private island, watching the sun sink into the ocean, he smiled at the perfection of karma served cold. Epilogue 5 years later, Josefina Torres, now back to her real name, Josefina Finch, wasn't where she'd imagined spending her 45th birthday. The complimentary breakfast, which had been prepared with care, remained untouched as she observed the hurried guests in their business attire. Her once manicured hands, now lined with the marks of regular work, told a story of life's journey. "Your shift starts in 20 minutes, her supervisor called out. "Table 4 needs clearing." Josefina nodded, adjusting her hotel uniform. She'd been working various jobs for the past 5 years and had found her way to this one 6 months ago. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of irony. She now worked in one of the hotels where she'd once met Fernando for their secret meeting. "Torres," a guest called out to her. "Coffee refill," he said. She grabbed the pot, forcing a smile. The designer dresses and society galas felt like a distant dream now. The woman who had once looked down on Daniel's boring life now spent her days clearing tables and changing sheets. Across town, in a simple suburban home, Fernando Lehman gazed at his laptop screen. Another rejection email from a potential investor. His third attempt at starting a new business had failed before it began. His name, once respected in real estate circles, was now toxic. "You're going to be late for work," Gladys called from the kitchen. Their reconciliation had come at a steep price. Complete financial transparency, a post-nuptial agreement that left him nothing if he strayed again, and a middle management job at her brother's construction supply company. "I'm coming," he replied, closing the laptop. His fancy office and car were now a thing of the past, replaced by a simple cubicle and a used Honda. His salary barely covered their new, smaller lifestyle and the ongoing therapy sessions Gladys had mandated. Elena Torres, Josefina's mother, sat in her garden, reading a letter from her other daughter in Miami. Unlike Josefina, Maria had built an honest life, married well, and now ran a successful business with her husband. "Mama," Josefina's voice called from the small guest house where she now lived. "I'm heading to work." Elena let out a sigh, remembering the day 5 years ago when Daniel's evidence had exposed her daughter's true nature. The social humiliation had been complete, and their family name, once respected in the community, was now whispered about in scandalized tones. In her cozy apartment above a laundromat, Sue Wilkins, the private investigator who documented Josefina's affair, was reviewing case files when a news alert caught her eye. Finch International Holdings, one of Daniel's shadow companies, had just completed another major acquisition. She smiled, remembering the careful man who'd hired her 6 years ago. His unexpected disappearance had become the stuff of urban legend in their circles. The businessman who outsmarted those who tried to destroy him and vanished without a trace. Jeffrey Church, now semi-retired but still handling select cases, occasionally received encrypted messages from untraceable accounts. These messages contained updates on business ventures and legal matters that needed to be handled. Everything was done through a network of shell corporations, all pointing back to the brilliant mind of Daniel Finch. Another wire transfer had come through, his assistant mentioned. "The Children's Hospital wing is fully funded." Daniel's generosity, like everything else about him, was a quiet force. The hospital wing would have another name, and the source of its funding was hidden behind layers of corporate entities. Maria, the former housekeeper, had received a generous severance package and glowing references when Daniel disappeared. Now, she's doing really well running her own cleaning business. She's got some great clients, but she's a bit puzzled because she never asked for these jobs. They just showed up. "Did you hear about Mrs. Finch?" one of her employees asked during lunch. "She's working at the Sunrise Plaza now. She's cleaning rooms." Maria crossed herself, remembering the proud woman who had treated her with such contempt. God's justice comes to everyone, sooner or later. At the exclusive Reynolds Club, where Josefina had once been a prominent member, her name had been quietly removed from the rolls. The recordings of her plotting Daniel's suicide had sealed her social death warrant. The women who had once been her closest friends now pretended not to see her when their paths crossed. "I saw Fernando at the grocery store," one society matron whispered to another over lunch. "Can you believe Gladys took him back? After what he did?" "Money," her companion replied. "Her family insisted, something about protecting their business interests. But I heard she keeps track of every penny he spends." Charlie Rowe, the investigator Josefina had hired to find Daniel, had long since closed her file. But every once in a while, he'd hear a few whispers in the professional world about major deals being closed by companies that seemed to appear from nowhere, operate with stunning efficiency, and then fade back into the corporate world. "Finch," he'd murmur, recognizing the strategy. Still out there, still winning. In their modest suburban life, Fernando and Gladys kept a calm peace. Their weekly therapy sessions had revealed the full extent of his character flaws, the narcissism, the financial manipulation, the endless lies. "How was work?" Gladys asked mechanically as Fernando returned home. "Fine," he replied, hanging up his jacket. His jacket, no longer designer, was a simple, off-the-rack purchase from a department store. Their conversations were polite, sanitized, devoid of the passion he'd claimed to find with Josefina. In his office, he had a single photo of him and Gladys from happier times. His phone contained a blocked number list full of Josefina's desperate attempts to contact him over the years. The last time he'd seen her was through the window of the Sunrise Plaza as he passed by. She was cleaning the lobby windows. The divorce settlement hadn't been kind to her, and her attempts to appeal were met with discouragement by judges. The evidence Daniel had gathered was irrefutable: the theft, the affair, the calculated plot to drive him to suicide. On his private island, Daniel Finch stood on the deck of his expanded villa, reviewing reports from his global business empire. At 50, he'd grown more distinguished, success and freedom adding an aura of quiet power to his bearing. "Sir," his assistant appeared with a tablet. "The latest intelligence report on the targets." Daniel reviewed the updates on those he'd left behind. He learned that Josefina was working at the hotel, and Fernando was stuck in suburban mediocrity. Their social circles were shattered, and their ambitions had been crushed under the weight of their own actions. "The Singapore development?" he asked, moving on to business matters. "It's doing better than expected by 20%. The London office is thinking about expanding into new markets." He nodded, making decisions worth millions with the same precision he'd once used to cook dinner in that kitchen where Josefina had announced her betrayal. The man she called boring now controlled a business empire that spanned continents. In her guest house behind her mother's home, Josefina sat on her bed after another exhausting shift. The tiny space was a far cry from the penthouse she'd once called home. On her dresser, a framed photo lay face down. It was a photo of her and Daniel on their wedding day, before the challenges of life had taken hold. She picked it up, and a pang of regret shot through her. She'd kept it, though she'd never display it again. It was all she had left of that former life, a reminder of what she'd thrown away. Elena watched from her kitchen window as her daughter left for another early morning shift. The woman who once plotted a man's death for his money now took buses to work, packed her lunch in plastic containers, and lived off of tips and minimum wage. "Maybe this is what you needed to learn humility," Elena whispered. Meanwhile, in Fernando's office, his brother-in-law watched him from his own cubicle, separated by glass walls. The man who had once boasted of destroying Daniel Finch now filled out inventory reports, supervised by people who had once been his subordinates. Layman, his supervisor, called. "The quarterly reports are due." Fernando bent over his work, trying not to let the knowing looks from his colleagues get to him. They'd heard the stories, read the news, and seen the evidence of his cruel plotting exposed. On his island, Daniel raised a glass to the sunset. His network of businesses was growing stronger every year, his influence spreading steadily but unnoticeably. The man they'd underestimated had not only survived their plot, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and free of the constraints of his old life. "Sir," his assistant appeared, "Mrs. Torres tried to access one of your old email accounts again." Daniel smiled warmly. "Let her. There's nothing to find." He then turned his attention back to the beautiful sunset. Some people never learn, do they? They confuse kindness with weakness and patience with passivity. It's a shame, because their own nature becomes their punishment. The lesson he'd learned proved true again and again. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's about letting their true nature do the work while you sit back and enjoy the show. In their separate lives of quiet desperation, Josefina and Fernando had learned the same harsh truth. They had plotted to destroy a man they thought was weak, but they discovered that what they had mistaken for weakness had been strength-gathering force. Their punishment wasn't just the loss of wealth and status. It was living with the knowledge that they destroyed themselves through their own greed and cruelty. Meanwhile, on his private island, Daniel Finch raised his glass to the setting sun. His empire was growing, his freedom was complete, and his revenge was a slow, steady process, following his betrayers for the rest of their lives. As night fell over the city they once called home, Daniel thought about how far he'd come. In her little guest house, Josefina set her alarm for another early shift. Meanwhile, in his suburban home, Fernando prepared for another day of mundane work under his brother-in-law's watchful eye. Meanwhile, on his island, Daniel Finch reviewed plans for his next business expansion. The man they called weak was now stronger and more successful than ever. He had come to realize that the best kind of revenge wasn't about taking away what someone held dear. It was about letting them live with the consequences of their choices, watching their own nature become their punishment while you thrived in the freedom they tried to steal. This is where our story comes to an end. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I'll see you there.